Really loud. All right. So I started already, obviously. Okay. As far as Zwingli is concerned, the biggest gathering that took place among the leading Protestant theologians was called the Marburg Colloquy. This is happening in the 1520s, which we know that on the German side of things is when a lot of the theologians were trying to get a position statement together. That's where the Diet of Speyer was around the same time. That was a German assembly where they brought a lot of their leading religious officials together. That's where the term Protestant came from. And they were trying to put down some kind of statement that said, this is what we stand for, this is our theology, this is how we would set up our church. And the meeting is headlined by Burger King and McDonald's here, Martin Luther and Ulrich Zwingli. And so at Marburg, the plan was they're going to sit down, they're going to hammer out some theology, they're going to write a position statement, and that way, if they're going to combat the Catholics, they're going to be able to do it as one group, united together, taking the best of the Swiss Confederation, taking the best of the German states, and being able to come up with something. And it broke up over the nature of the Eucharist. Do you remember me talking about that on Friday? Does anybody remember those terms? I told you lots of big time vocabulary. What were the three?
The Eucharist.
The Eucharist is the host, the bread and the wine. Okay. So what was the battle that was taking place?
Consubstantiation, transubstantiation, memorial.
And what were the difference between the three? Transubstantiation is whose version? No, that's the Catholic's version. It's the idea that the bread and the wine is transformed into the body and blood of Christ through a ceremony in which the priestly blessing makes the transformation. Luther's the middle ground. His is his is not memorial. His is consubstantiation. Luther is the middle ground. It's called the doctrine of inner presence, which is hard to explain, but he's like, the bread and the wine is the body and blood of Christ. It doesn't have to go through a priestly blessing in order to get there. It fits the eliminate the middleman part of Luther's theology. The rest of the Protestant reformers, including Calvin, including Zwingli, were memorial. And the idea, remember, like pouring it out for the homies. Right? That was from the other day. Okay? So do this in memory of me was the biggest part of the Last Supper. And it sounds kind of a very mundane or sort of silly way to break up a conference, but that's what broke up the conference. I guess if you're a theologian, that would piss you off enough that you would want to leave. But the nature of the Eucharist is what kept the Protestants from gathering together, and why Zwingli and his crew ended up leaving, and why Luther and his crew ended up leaving, and they kind of decided to do their own thing at that point. Okay? A lot of what ultimately happens in Switzerland kind of mimics what was taking place in Germany in terms of now it's not about theological battles, it's about actual battles, where the Swiss cantons had more or less divided themselves among Catholic Swiss cantons and Protestant Swiss cantons, and Zwingli was kind of the head of those Protestant Swiss cantons. And they ended up having a couple of battles, and I don't know if it's on the map. Can anybody see the city called Kappel? Kappel. I don't see it. Either way, and you can kind of make out what's going on here, but the different states, if you will, are in a battle, and the second battle is significant because Zwingli ends up getting caught in the crossfires between these warring factions. The Catholics or the Forest cantons are battling against the Protestants, and the Catholics were actually battling because they thought the Protestants were going to deny them freedom of worship. It's kind of an irony that the Catholics were worried about the Protestants taking away their freedom of worship. So it ended up becoming a battle, and these two battles ended up taking place, and Luther ended up dying on the battlefield in the second one. Yes?
You said Zwingli got.
Did I say Luther? I meant Zwingli. Yeah, Luther's not going to die in Switzerland. Okay. But that's what ultimately happens. The Zwingli's demise is that he dies on the battlefield in the middle of these Canton Wars, and that they have their own sort of peace treaty, very similar to the Peace of Augsburg, where after he dies, the Protestants and the Catholics kind of work it out amongst themselves that they can worship the way that they want to worship. So freedom of worship is granted in Switzerland, but unfortunately, Zwingli gets caught in the crossfires. Okay. All right, John Calvin, what do we know about this guy? This is a really, really important part of the Protestant Reformation. Some would say that Calvinism has a much bigger impact on the world than Lutheranism did. Lutheranism was ultimately confined to the northern states in Germany and eventually Scandinavia, whereas Calvinism was in the Netherlands, Calvinism was in a whole bunch of areas in France, Calvinism was in Switzerland, Calvinism was in some of the German states, Calvinism eventually made its way to England and Scotland. It was a very dynamic religion. And it kind of started with this Frenchman who had fled because a lot of the same ideas that Luther and Zwingli had, Calvin also had. And as he was worshiping in the way that he wanted to worship, or as he became more vocal, Catholics in France started to persecute him. So he left and went to Switzerland because Switzerland was kind of a safety zone for people that were fleeing because of religious persecution. And he eventually made his way to Geneva. He was going to go to Strasbourg. He ended up staying because a couple of theologians wanted him to hang out in Geneva because they wanted to set up a church. And you can see where Geneva is relative to the rest of Switzerland. It's near Lake Geneva. Go figure. Okay. What do we know about Calvin? This is a lot better than Luther. You only need to know one work. It's called The Institutes of Christian Religion. It was written in 1536. All of Calvin's philosophy or theology falls into this category. There's a link here that if you look on here where it says principal ideas, it's what's referred to in European history as the tulip. All right, kind of gives you some background about the tulip and gives you what each of the acronyms stands for. T is total depravity. U is unconditional election. L is limited atonement. I is irresistible grace. And P is perseverance of the saints. We're not going to get into all the details, but you can read it. Generally, by the time we get to April, what do you need to know about Calvin's theology? You only had 3 days to take a look at it. What is his doctrine? What is it about? Yes. A lot of them are part of that, of getting rid of the middleman, sure. Okay. What separates Calvin from Luther, for instance, or maybe some of the other reformers? Yes.
He believes in predestination.
What does that mean?
It means that your fate is already set for you. So no matter what, like when you're born, you have if you're going to heaven or if you're not.
And it's about the fact that human beings are wicked and evil and sinful people, and you're kind of stuck in that spot, right? God is this really, really powerful, omnipotent, omnipresent figure who has determined from the beginning who is going to be saved and who isn't going to make it. All right. And the people that God has more or less decided from the get-go are going to get salvation, the small gift that is made by somebody that really didn't need to do it, but is going to do it anyway because of the graceful God, is going to save the group called the elect. So predestination means God's already determined from the beginning of time who's going to be saved, who's going to be damned, and then the elect is the name of the group of those that are saved. Okay? That sucks, kind of. Wouldn't you say? Because there's not a whole lot that you can do about it. All right. I mean, this is about as far from Catholicism as you can think of, because Catholicism, at least to some degree, you had works that you could do to show your worthiness to God. There was some element of, control that the people would have. But Calvin's basically saying that God's in control. You are not. There's nothing that you can really do. it creates a whole bunch of hypocrisies as far as Calvin is concerned. Okay. What would be the response if you found out, well, you're going to probably be saved, you might be damned, I don't know, but it's out of your control. Somebody else is going to have to determine it. You have a couple of choices that you could make. All right. If God is as powerful as you say, and God is going to give everybody this gift of grace or whatever, then he's not going to take it back. So whatever is already going to happen is going to happen. There's nothing that you can do to reverse that course. So what does that mean for you? You can do whatever you want. Yeah. Party until it's 2023. You know, if you want to. What is Calvin's response to that? The people that are just like, hey, you know what? I'm going to have some fun. I'm going to turn on my Metallica. I'm going to have a party. And, if I was going to be saved, great. If I'm not, nothing I can do about it now. What is his response, Davis?
The fact that like they're doing those, that they want to do that shows that they're predetermined to not make it.
Yeah, it's not all that deep. It's just the idea that the elect would never think that way. Okay. If you were truly among the elect, there is some kind of feeling intimately because of the way that you live your life, the piety that you show, the hard work, the thriftiness, the sternness, the God worshipiness that you provide on a day-to-day indicates that you're among those few select. Okay. But there's also this concern that Calvin has that there's a lot of imposters amongst them and that they've constantly got to be on guard, and that Geneva was supposed to be this bastion where those who identified themselves as the elect, that they would go. Okay. And this would be like, I mean, if God was flying around on Judgment Day looking for a place to land, the runway would be the brightest in Geneva. That's why they called it a city that was a church. It was going to be the most pious, perfect place that you could ever go. A perfect representation of God's true people. Yes.
Did he have a lot of followers?
They started to get quite a following. Yeah. I mean, there's people, first it started small, but yeah, I mean, after a while, like there were people that were leaving from England, people that were leaving from Scotland, whole bunch of people that were coming in from France, people that were coming in from the German states. By about 1550 or 60, Geneva is like the place to be. Like they're buying in to this idea that they are a city that was a church. Is that a really fair and accurate assessment of what Geneva was like? Like this great, great place where everybody sort of is the very quintessence of what God would find in somebody that was targeted for salvation? What did it look like instead? Because he ended up creating a group called the Consistory, which was a secret police force that judged, that would read people's mail, that would legislate against them on a daily to make sure that the imposters or the devils that were amongst them were rooted out and punished and hopefully banned. It was a pretty, and that's what I said, either a city that was a church or it's a spiritual police state. All right. But the Genevan consistory was sort of like having henchmen, like stormtroopers or something like that, that would go and make sure that this was the most religiously devout place that you'd ever see. What are some calling cards of a community that would look like this? There are some things where you know that you are amongst Calvinists. How many lime green dresses did you see out there? A lot of dance halls, gambling, drunkenness, lots of taverns. Is that what Geneva looked like? Not in the least. It's like the cover, it's like Hester Prynne's Scarlet Letter, kind of like Puritanism. Puritan is just the English derivative of Calvin's Geneva. Yeah. Lime green is a bright, loud color that's going to draw attention to you and take the attention off of God. So everything that they wore was those stern American Gothic looking like black and whites. Okay. You saw the pilgrims you kind of know what that is. All right. But, this is not a fun and games kind of joint. All right. And they would legislate against it. I wanted to open up this section right here.
What was the secret police force called?
Secret police force called the Genevan Consistory. And I mean, they were kind of the eyes and ears of the institution to enforce whatever the rules happened to be. All right. And here's the kind of stuff, blasphemy. That's an obvious one. Whoever shall have blasphemed, swearing by the body or blood of our Lord, like if you stub your foot, you're like, geez, like that. Here comes the police. All right.
Were they like tax exempt?
You will be made to kiss the earth for the first offense, for the second to pay 5 sous, whatever that is, for the third 6 sous, and the last offense be put in the pillory for an hour. So if you have a loose lip or whatever, and you let a couple of gods or whatever slip out, you're in real trouble. Drunkenness. No one shall invite another to drink under the penalty of 3 sous. Like, hey, have a beer. Oh, consistory rolls out. Okay. Anyone found to be intoxicated shall pay for the first offense 3 sous, shall be remanded to the consistory. For the second offense, they shall be held to pay the sum of 6 sous. And for the third, they're going to be put in prison. So you're found drunk 3 times, you're going to jail. Songs and dances. If anyone sing immoral, dissolute, or outrageous songs, or dance the virilette, or other dance, he shall be put in prison for 3 days. Games. This means like any kind of spectator or any kind of participatory sport, especially if it were on Sunday. Okay? Could you imagine nowadays with the NFL? The whole freaking world would be put into prison for, in Geneva because you have made a mockery out of God's day. Not Roger Goodell saying, hey, God, this is my day, does not belong to you anymore. But it was God's day in Calvin's Geneva, and the consistory was there to punish people. Okay? What was the worst thing that you could do? So you can't wear bright colors. They even has anybody ever seen what a Calvinist church would look like? There's going to be no stained glass. There's no statues. There's no central processional, where the people come and then, kind of do the thing with the incense. There's going to be none of that stuff. It's going to be benches. There's going to be a pulpit, and that's it. Anything else is distraction. Calvinists are iconoclasts. Does anybody know what that term means? Jack? They don't want graven or sacred images. So yeah, if you want to know there was a Calvinist uprising in a town, usually a statue got busted, or they broke some stained glass, or they wrecked an altarpiece or something like that. Yeah.
Wait, so was Calvin the head of Geneva?
Yes.
He made all the moves?
He made all the moves along with a couple of his theologian friends.
Yeah, what happened? Was there a duke or duchess of Geneva?
No. It was considered a free city, and it's a pure theocracy, the closest thing you will ever find at that time, which means that your religious people are also your political people.
Wait, so these elects, were they tax exempt? What's the word?
What do you mean tax exempt? No, everybody paid taxes. You still had to run the city.
Okay.
All right. They still had to, pass laws to make sure that trade happened and things like that. You still had to be able to make a living. And this is the other, and I'll talk about this a little bit more as we go through, but there's a sociologist in the early 20th century. His name is Max Weber, Weber. And he wrote this book called The Protestant Ethic. Okay. And there's different social classes that kind of identify with different Protestant groups. The one that most identified with the Calvinists was the middle class. Okay. And in fact, if you look at the areas where Calvinism really took off, it would be in places that had a thriving middle class. The Swiss confederations would be those territories, not northern Italy, surprisingly enough. Not surprisingly enough, if you think about how embedded and powerful the church is in those areas. But if you went to England, if you went to Scotland, eventually into the Americas, this kind of ethic sort of carried itself. The Netherlands was another area where a lot of Calvinists ended up kind of turning it in to like another Calvinist enclave. But they also mentioned that the rise of Protestantism, and particularly this brand of Calvinism, also kind of aligned itself with the rise of capitalism and the ideas of individual worth and individual power, and that there was even this belief that material wealth was God kind of winking at you saying, yeah, you're doing it the right way. Because it's a self-made kind of wealth. It's not the kind of wealth where you inherit it from somebody or you get it by merely being associated with some noble group. But if you work hard, you invest your money, all that stuff that you would hear later on, like with Benjamin Franklin, like a penny saved is a penny earned, and a stitch in time saves nine. Early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. These are people that are working hard. They're putting their money into, they're investing in their future. They're investing in their schooling. They don't draw a lot of attention to themselves. They don't have gaudy mansions. They don't have a lot of bling. They're very simple folks, and they kind of testified to this ethic. Yes.
I was actually talking to my dad about Calvinism in the Netherlands, and even now, even though the religion isn't that popular, all those exact ideals, you can still see them all around the place.
Absolutely. And it was one before the United States. It was the area where we got to see what the United States was going to look like in this early 1700s based on what the Netherlands looked like in the early 1600s. So we'll get there. Yeah.
So it's like kind of the opposite of like those mega churches that have the lights and the
we're going to talk about it when we get to the Catholic Reformation, because that's one of the things that the church is going to use as its arsenal, is to say, let's look at the bling. Because they were able to take art movements and then devote that and say, we're just going to bring the converts back from Protestantism by just building the biggest basilicas that we can find. All right. But Calvin, those folks were dead set against that. They wanted pulpit, they wanted preacher, and that's all they were going to get. All right. Besides the spiritual police state, besides the fact that you could go to prison if you're singing the wrong song, the worst possible thing that you could be in Calvin's Geneva, and this is the great hypocrisy, is somebody that had a set of ideas that differed from Calvin's ideas. Okay. So just like Luther, remember when he was like, there's nothing more harmful or injurious than a rebel. Calvin, it's the same thing. And the biggest and most celebrated case of this is called the Miguel de Cervantes case. Okay. I'm going to talk about him in just a second. It's up here on the board, but it's Servetus, Cervantes. He's Spanish. Okay. We know what it's like to be in Spain and have ideas that run contrary to Catholic doctrine. Spain had the Inquisition. Okay. Cervantes grew up and started to get really intelligent, started reading for himself. And the thing that kind of bugged him the most was the Holy Trinity. Again, is anybody familiar with this? When you say God the Father, the God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, that's the Trinity. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And people are kind of wondering, well, wait a second. So Jesus is also God, but Jesus is also the Son of God. And then who's the Holy Spirit? And how does that all work? Okay. In Catholic doctrine, this is a very difficult thing to be able to explain to thinking people, how God can be all three things at the same time. And so Miguel de Cervantes started writing about that. And he ended up publishing this work called On the Errors of the Trinity. And the Spanish found out about it, and they were going to burn him. So he left. And you can see him, kind of running from Spain or whatever. And then Calvin meets him. So, how you doing, brother? He's like, you freaking crazy people in Spain, man. They were going to burn me. Sometimes you just don't have ideas that jibe with Catholic doctrine. They make a lot of mistakes, bro. And Calvin's like, yeah, I know. I was in France. I felt the same kind of pressures. That's why I'm here. But relax, because you're amongst friends. And Servetus is like, hey, man, that's great. I'm glad to hear that. We should be in a place where we can worship the way we want to worship. Calvin's like, okay. So that's fine. That sounds cool. What is it exactly that, tipped off the Spanish, or why were they upset at you? And Servetus is like, I wrote this book. It's called On the Errors of the Trinity. And what I was basically denying was that God could be the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit all at the same time. It's called anti-Trinitarianism, sort of my thing. And Calvin was like, what? And the consistoracy was like, oh? And they seized him. And Servetus was sort of like, hey, maybe I could just leave. You guys clearly got your thing going on here. I've got my thing. I must have stepped upon the wrong space or whatever. Good luck to you, but I'm just going to be on my way. And Calvin's like, nah, you're not going to go on your way, because ultimately you'll go to another town and then you'll contaminate them with these heretical ideas. So we need to cleanse your soul. And of course, that means we've got to burn you. And so they set fire to Servetus. I'll talk about that in just a second. But no, there's not a video. It's just a photo. It's a painting. Yeah, it's a pretty good painting. Looks like a photo. Whoops. Oh, yeah. I always attributed this quote to the other guy, and it turns out that the person that said it was Michael Servetus himself. And I thought it was some pretty profound stuff. He says, to kill a man is not to defend a doctrine, but to kill a man. As they were killing him, I thought that was a pretty dope thing to say, because that's exactly what they were doing. They were just merely killing this guy because he had ideas that were different from him. And what makes it really sad is that Calvin was a guy just like him. Yes. This it's very loose. It doesn't stay up. So Miguel de Servetus is burned at the stake. And when you look at the Calvinists, they were really good at persecuting other people. Okay. When we get into witchcraft persecution, I think Calvinists were definitely number one in that regard. Persecution of Anabaptists, we're about to talk about them. That's another group that they went after pretty hardcore. And we'll talk about the reasons why. But Calvin's Geneva was a very scary place, except for the people that felt themselves to be among the elect. They felt like they were in a spectacular place. All right. And their ideas ended up becoming very, very popular, to the point where there was a lot of really dedicated missionaries that spent time training in Geneva. They even had an academy, which was their great religious academy, called the Genevan Academy. And they would use that as a foundational piece to end up going out into virtually every area that they could to spread the Calvinist faith. This is another quote from this figure by the name of Sebastian Castellio, another guy that had learned about Servetus's burning, and said this quote up here, which says, men are puffed up with knowledge or with a false opinion of knowledge and look down upon others. Pride is followed by cruelty and persecution, so that now scarcely anyone is able to endure another who differs at all from him. Interesting quote, considering the times in which we live. Although opinions are almost as numerous as men, nevertheless there is hardly any sect which does not condemn all others and desire to reign alone. Hence arise banishments, chains, imprisonments, stakes, and gallows in this miserable rage to visit daily penalties upon those who differ from the mighty about matters hitherto unknown, for so many centuries disputed and not yet cleared up. And there's another guy that's going to be writing around the same time, because what Castillo is telling you is what the Enlightenment is going to be about. Is like, there's a lot of people that have killed a lot of other people in the name of things that they cannot prove and never will be able to prove. My religion is better than yours. My political opinion is better than yours. My country is better than yours. My ethnicity is better than yours. My gender is better than yours. And then, yes, my race is better than yours. Okay. At this time, though, he's smack dab in the middle of religious persecution. Anybody guess that Castillo died? He was burned. I think he was hanged, actually. Somebody check on that.
It could be both.
Yeah. Okay, the Anabaptists. This is a different group, and they kind of, I'll show you the map on them because they really, really had a hard time finding a place to go. All right. And we'll explain why. But the key parts of Anabaptism, yes.
Really, he died of heart failure, and then his enemies unearthed his body, then burned it.
Okay. Yeah, that's good.
And it's gotta, yeah.
That's reasonable.
That's what caused it.
Yes. And then his afterlife went on unnaturally. Because oftentimes when people couldn't get to them before they died, they waited until after they died. Then they dug up their bones and did like awful things. That's what they did to Wycliffe or Whitcliffe. You know, they would scatter their bones in a variety of different directions. That's what happened to Zwingli. After Zwingli dies, they like scattered his bones into a whole bunch of different directions. Yeah, obviously, or they wouldn't do it, right? The people that follow him and worship him would probably be pretty upset about it. Yeah. Yeah.
Wasn't it also thought about like the body had to be together?
The body had to be together. Yeah. You
So
know,
it's basically
so it's a way of making sure that they had no restful afterlife. Yeah. There's part of that too. It's some of the reason why in old religious beliefs that you wouldn't do an autopsy or you wouldn't like work on cadavers is because there was a fear that you're like desecrating the body. Okay. The Anabaptists are what we could call the left wing of the Reformation. If there was one that actually spoke to like the lowest classes and the lowest orders, because in a lot of cases, these became very rural movements and they were really dedicated to kind of the people themselves. All right. The key ideas in Anabaptism and the ones that kind of set them aside, Anabaptist infant baptism. That they believe that, when we have confirmation in Roman Catholicism, but there was this belief, this practice of, baptizing infants, that they had not made a free election to be part of that faith. And so that they were kind of null and void. It's almost like they were baptized into a faith under duress because they never had the ability to make a choice about whether this was a religious community that they wanted to be part of or not be part of. All right. So the idea was to go and to baptize adults, all right, or rebaptize people as adults. That's one thing that kind of symbolizes Anabaptism, was the rejection of infant baptism. And if you're the Calvinists or other people that didn't believe in that idea, you found that idea to be about as unholy as it could get, because you got all these innocent children that are now walking around, who don't have, the royal anointment or whatever the case may be. All right. But they were the ultimate in free will in saying people need to come to this on their own. And if they don't come to it, we shouldn't hold them captive to somebody else's wishes. Pacifism. This isn't always used by the Anabaptists, but you could say, like, for the most part, Anabaptists abided by this idea that they should not take up arms against other people. Okay. We'll explain. Like, the easiest way to explain the Anabaptists is if you've been in this country or if you've ever visited places like Indiana or Pennsylvania, think of the Amish. Is anybody familiar with the Amish? Ever been to an Amish community? Like a real one, not like woke Amish that have phones and, and PlayStations and things like that.
My grandfather lived in Pennsylvania, so the Amish kids would like try to get rides in like cars and everything.
Interesting. Yeah.
Because of the care, because the Amish people.
Yeah. I mean, I grew up in northern Indiana, and it was part of what they call the Mennonite communities. Mennonites are followers of Menno Simons. Menno Simons was one of the great Anabaptist leaders in the 16th century, but they were so persecuted in Europe that eventually they made their way to North America, and they set up in places like Pennsylvania, and they set up in places like Ohio and Indiana. And yeah, I mean, I can't tell you how many days I sat in my car behind a horse and buggy because there were one-lane roads. Or it's kind of peaceful. There was this fishing hole that I used to go to when I was a kid, and we would be out fishing, and all you'd hear is on the outside. Or playing basketball against a school where they had like 3 last names on the entire team. Because you either you're a Yoder, you were a Bontrager, or you were a Hostetler, and the entire school had one of 3 last names. Yeah.
Would the Amish people like also kind of be like the Calvinists and like simplicity and stuff?
It's a different kind of thing because Calvinism itself was sort of dedicated to the idea that the church and state were kind of part of the same operation. They were a theocracy. They did believe in that sort of thing. The Amish were like, we don't want to be involved at all. We want to take an oath that basically, this is the other reason that they were persecuted. Not only would they not take up, the Amish are a derivative of the Anabaptists.
Oh, for real?
Yeah. The Amish are the Amish that settled in the United States came because of the persecution that they faced in Europe, because they were the most persecuted group because of theology, because of their inability to want to take up arms, which means that they're not supporting any of like the state causes to like declare war on anybody else. They were like, you guys can have that. But it was also the part where they said a church should in fact be a church, not a state church, not like a city church. A church is like its own thing. And all they wanted to do was sort of like live a like Christ and the apostles like existence and not have to worry about what the state happened to be doing. And the way that they sort of read that was they're kind of acting as a group within a group, meaning it's a little too cultish, that they don't want to participate in any of the things that are going on, but yet they wall themselves off in these communities and they don't really want to do with anybody else. So eventually they ended up getting rubbed the wrong way because there were Anabaptists that were part of a couple of the biggest uprisings in the 1520s and 30s. One of them was the German Peasants' Revolt, where it turned out that a lot of the members of, or at least some members of the Anabaptists were supportive of the German peasants because they identified with the lower orders and they identified with persecution. So you kind of do the math, and if you're a German prince and you're like, the German peasants rose up against us, and then it's like Anabaptists were among the German peasants, they're like, Anabaptists rose up against us. So now they're the very thing that they thought they were, which was we're a group within a group, that is like a cult that is like brandishing some like effort to try to eventually overthrow us. So they've always been kind of like misunderstood in that way. Yes.
So you said the Anabaptists were kind of like with the German princes.
They were against the German prince. There was Anabaptists that were associated with the German Peasants' Revolt. In fact, one of the figures' name was Thomas Müntzer. And Thomas Müntzer was a big kind of like individual figure that was supporting the German peasants. And then word got out that Thomas Müntzer also embraced Anabaptist ideas and therefore sort of like got swept with a brush that says all Anabaptists are like brigands or rebels. Okay. And then there was this unfortunate event where the Anabaptist took over a city in the German states called Münster. And it got a little weird.
They got a cheese, right?
They got a cheese, but yeah, I mean, Münster is a very famous city in the German states, and it was an enclave for the Anabaptists. And they ended up like walling off the city and then wouldn't let anybody else come in. And that despite the fact that the majority, you guys listening? I'm sorry. Despite the fact that there was a lot of people that the Anabaptists identified and said, we're never going to take up arms, these guys took up arms. And so now they're considered violent insurrectionists. And then the other thing was because so many Anabaptist men were killed in the uprisings that there was this huge disparity between men and women that some of the leaders of the Munster rebels decided that polygamy would be okay. So they had like 6 or 7 wives. This is not a core ideal of Anabaptism. It was a core ideal of this incident in Munster. So now, again, by kind of association, this is what Anabaptists do. They wall themselves off in towns. They start taking up arms. And now they're like polygamists. And we knew they were a cult. And now it's clear they're a cult. So then the number of thousands of Anabaptists that found themselves persecuted, whether in Switzerland or the Swiss cantons or whether in the German states, it became kind of outrageous. Yes.
So I looked it up, and it says they also declared themselves New Jerusalem.
Yeah. Okay. But what does that do?
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, the fact of the matter is that they were paid, at least paid attention to women. They paid attention to the lowest orders. They didn't want to stir with anybody else. They just wanted to be able to worship the way they wanted to worship. And they found themselves in a position where they couldn't do it. So, as far as the notes are concerned, when we talk about, these are just some individuals that are associated with them. Conrad Grebel, if you hear that name, he's sort of like the founder of the Anabaptists. They had their own sort of like document that stood for their core theological beliefs. It was called the Schleitheim Confession. So everybody's kind of got their thing. Luther's got the Augsburg Confession, and then the Institutes of Christian Religion is sort of what identifies the Calvinists. Okay, and then Thomas Müntzer, I mentioned to you, was a leader of the German Peasants' Revolt that also happened to be an Anabaptist. But generally, these are folks that were persecuted in a lot of different places in Europe. And that's why the New World became sort of a refuge for them, particularly in the mid to late 1600s, because a lot of people were fleeing Europe because they were being persecuted. And then they wanted to go and settle in places in the Americas where they could worship. If they did survive, they survived in tiny little pockets in the very like northwestern sector of the German states. And then some areas in the present day Netherlands. But outside of that, there wasn't really a lot. It's just a scene of adult baptism. This is some areas where you could at least see on the map within the Holy Roman Empire where there was some Anabaptists. Obviously, we mentioned Munster, but you can see in the present day Netherlands, there was a couple of areas there. There were some areas in Switzerland, and then there were some areas in the western part of the Holy Roman Empire. And these are just maps generally, because we're kind of done today, to show you where Protestantism in and of itself was kind of moving. If you are in green here, you are more or less still Catholic. So you can see that the German states, particularly in the north, and then eventually the Scandinavian states adopted Lutheranism. And that you even saw some Lutherans that were popping up in present-day Poland, present-day Lithuania. All right? Big Lutheran or a big Calvinist settlement in Hungary, of all places, which I thought was interesting. But then you can see, like along the border areas between Switzerland and the German states, lots of Calvinism in a lot of different spots in France, Calvinism in the Netherlands, Calvinism in England, and Calvinism in Scotland. All right, but we'll talk about some of those, like especially in the modern day UK, England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland. We'll talk about that tomorrow when we get into Henry and his love life. Yes?
When was like the Holy Roman Empire not a thing anymore?
It starts to disappear as we get closer to the French Revolution. So it goes through modifications. The Holy Roman Empire as a thing,
Like the 17th.
the Holy Roman Empire as a thing is not formally dissolved until Napoleon dissolves it in like 1807. After that, it's referred to as the Confederation of the Rhine. And then after that, it's referred to as the German Confederation. And then eventually it becomes Germany. Okay? But Holy Roman Empire is this big, massive territory that would comprise modern-day Austria, that would comprise some portions of modern-day Denmark, and then would bring Germany together.
Which like Luther was like doing his thing in the Holy Roman Empire.
Yes, in the German states. And like I said, Frederick, you missed this on Friday, but we kind of explained all of this. But and that's why you should watch the screencast. But part of the reason why Luther was successful, remember, was because
The German princes. Like that.
right. But one of those German princes was part of what we call the 7 German electors. Anybody remember where the 7 German electors was created? What the organization was called? No, the Schmalkaldic League was the Lutheran princes that agreed to fight against Charles in order to become Lutheran. But this was the original document that created 7 German electors drawn from the best, or like the most populous or most powerful of the 7 German states. And then they would determine who the Holy Roman Emperor was going to be. And one of those electors was Frederick the Wise of Saxony, who protected Luther. But it was a gathering in 1356. Does anybody know what it was called? Go ahead. What was the meeting that took place that created the 7 German electors in 1356? The Golden Bull. Who said that? Critique. Good job. Okay.
What religion is orange?
It's called Eastern Orthodox, but it's Orthodox Christianity. Mhm. Okay. And then down here is Islam. Okay. Here's one thing that I missed on. I must have fast forwarded too much, but it was it just had a list of names of people that had taken Calvinism into different directions. Okay. A couple of very important noble women from France, Margaret d'Angoulême and Jeanne d'Albret, were the ones that were going. I mean, remember that Geneva itself and Calvin was French, and it was very close to the French border. So there was a lot of people, especially those that were kind of upset at the fact that the Catholic king in France was trying to consolidate power, that Protestant enclaves popped up in and around France for the very reasons that Germans adopted Lutheranism, that this might be a mechanism for them to be able to assert more political independence or power. All right. Martin Bucer in England, the Zells in Strasbourg. We're going to talk about John Knox. His nickname was the Thundering Scot. But eventually Calvinism is going to pop up in Scotland. Theodore Beza, and this guy named Heinrich Bullinger. Bullinger was not Calvinist. He was Zwinglian after Zwingli died. He kind of took over in Zurich. But Theodore Beza was the one that took over for Calvin after Calvin died and founded the Genevan Academy. But like I said, most dynamic of the Protestant movements, and the fact that they ended up in so many different places. So anybody have any questions about Zwingli, Calvin, the Anabaptists? Yes.
I'm a little confused on the Marburg colloquy. How you say that?
Colloquy, the Colloquy of Marburg.
Okay, so it didn't work out. Why?
It didn't work out because they had this taste great, less filling debate between the nature of the Eucharist. You, again, missed that on Friday, but we explained that when you get to a certain part in like Catholic worship and then eventually in other forms, like in the Catholic Mass, there's a portion of the Mass where there's a reference back to the Last Supper. And Jesus is like, take this is my body. It has been shed for you. And then take this is my blood. That when they're doing or performing that, the priest is holding up the host, and then he's holding up the chalice, that something is taking place in that ceremony called transubstantiation, where the Eucharist is going from being just bread and wine and transforming itself into the body and blood of Christ. Luther kind of took a middle ground, but stuck to the eliminate the middleman plan, where he said, I believe that. I believe that when we eat the host or when we drink the wine, that we are taking in Jesus. And though, in that way, it's called the doctrine of inner presence, or consubstantiation. And then Zwingli and a handful of other theologians said, the part that you need to focus on is the part where Jesus says, do this in memory of me. So the memorialists believe that when you're eating the bread and drinking the wine, you're eating the bread and drinking wine, but you're thinking about what Jesus had sacrificed on your behalf, which is equivalent to like pouring liquor out for your homies. All right. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about that?
So did Calvin he probably did.
Calvin also believed in memorialism.
Wait, he didn't drink that.
They had grape juice,
So, okay.
or they had sometimes they'll do like the champagne one, but it's like sparkling grape juice and some good crackers. Delaney?
So was it not until like the Marburg Republic that like Zwingli and Luther like broke up?
That's the point where they got together for the first time. In other words, like Zwingli's doing his thing in the Swiss confederations, Luther's doing his thing in the German states, and then somebody's trying to bring them all together. In fact, it's a guy by the name of Philip Margrave of Hesse. He was one of the Lutheran princes who was trying to assert Lutheranism in his area. And he's like, I want to get all the theologians together because maybe we could have like one big Protestant faith and there's strength in numbers. So he brought Luther and Zwingli together and said, hammer out some kind of theological position that if we were to hand this to the Roman Catholic Church, we could say this is what we believe in. And they couldn't figure it out because they couldn't decide on this one doctrinal matter what they were going to stand for. So the Marburg Colloquy breaks up at that point. Okay. Got 10 minutes. Let's do this real quick. Just as is a way of review a little bit. There was a phrase in On Christian Liberty that got the German peasants psyched up. What was that phrase? The one that they used as a basis for their revolt. Martin Luther wrote this book called On Christian Liberty in 1520. What was the phrase that they were going to take and kind of make it their own? You're on it.
A Christian man is the most free Lord of all and subject to none.
There it is. A Christian man is the most free Lord of all and subject to none. Okay. What was the name of, this is more trivia. What was the name of the German prince's military organization that beat back the German peasants? It was named after one of the towns where one of the most concentrated parts of the German peasants' revolt. Anybody know? It's called the Swabian League. Not to be confused with the Schmalkaldic League that we had, the Swabian League. Okay. What was the reason that Luther decided to become an Augustinian monk? Carol?
That was a really bad thunderstorm, and he said that if God saved him, then he would become a monk.
Okay, so he became a monk. Yes?
There's also like this, I forget his name. It was like he owed money to like the Fuggers.
Yes, the Fuggers.
Albrecht, and that was going on like right where Luther was like teaching, and he's like, and one of them was selling like, what was that?
What was his name?
John Tetzel.
Tetzel.
Okay,
Yeah, Tetzel was like the used car salesman for indulgences. And that was the one, and the indulgences are being sold in jurisdictions that Martin Luther is ultimately speaking about. And indulgences is the worst kind of bastardization of the idea that you need good works in order to achieve salvation. It's like they're basically saying your good works could literally be take out your paycheck or take out your checkbook. In other words, yes, sir.
What was the German prince's army?
The German prince's army?
Yeah.
To beat back the peasants' revolt, it's called the Swabian League. What was the name of the peace treaty that gave German princes the right to choose their religion? It's important. It's like one of the three most important treaties in the early part of our course. Kia?
Augsburg.
Augsburg. The Peace of Augsburg, 1555. Okay.
You said piece of Augsburg.
Augsburg.
So that
Yeah.
Oh,
I would, and this is for anyone, but I would definitely watch the screencasts if you missed them, because a lot of this stuff has been gone over. Jack, you too, because you weren't here for leadership the other day. But we went over a lot of just some of the political stuff to explain, why things kind of went down the way that they did. Yeah.
Is it a possibility that Luther just like didn't like his parents, so he didn't want to go back?
I think he was scared to death of his parents. His mom used to beat him. His father used to beat him. And his father also was one of those made a lot of sacrifices on his behalf and didn't want to disappoint him kind of thing.
So could the hurricane be an excuse?
Could have been an excuse. I think that he was in inner turmoil because he was really worried about the fact that he was never going to be worthy of getting salvation. And yeah, that could have gotten baked into his upbringing. Like he's never going to be worthy no matter what he does. So you could say that God is really his dad or God is really his mom and dad, and it just kind of got transferred in that way. What was the name of the place where Luther stands his ground and says, unless I'm convinced by scripture, Willow, what was the name of the meeting? Diet of Worms. You can't not know that, right? I mean, it's very rare that one would have a diet of worms. Okay. Worms. Worms was the place where they finally settled the investiture controversy. So it's kind of a famous place. Why did Charles not burn Luther, Alexis? What about them? Because if you wrote that as your response on the test, I would say, could you please elaborate?
Because they supported Luther.
Yeah, not all that deep. Can anybody give me a more in-depth response?
The Ottoman Empire was about to smack them.
That's good. What does that mean?
They needed the princes to
The German prince, there is no middle class to speak of. You cannot do what Ferdinand and Isabella, what Louis the Spider King, what Henry Tudor did, and recruit a whole bunch of people from the middle class, or even hire enough mercenaries that are going to be able to defeat the Ottoman Empire. He needed those German princes. And if the German princes allied with Luther, Charles knew that he had to be very careful and tread very lightly, because if he antagonizes the princes, the thing that he cared about maybe even more than his Catholicism was the fact that he had a kingdom and he didn't want to lose any pieces of that kingdom. All right, yeah.
Can you go over the connection between Pope Leo X and Archbishop
Yeah. Both of them were trying to raise revenues. Okay. The other thing is that what ties Leo to Archbishop Albrecht is that Albrecht purchased 3 different religious offices. And that in order to get that, he was going to need a papal dispensation. And most likely, if he was going to get a papal dispensation, he was going to have to pay for it. Because it's not like the Pope is just going to be like, oh, I'm just going to be a sweet guy, so I'm going to make you the Archbishop of these places and the Bishop of this place. He's like, if you can give me, like, say, 300,000 ducats, I'll hook you up. So he borrowed the money in order to do that. Now he's got to pay back those bankers who usually charge usury. They charge interest on top of those loans. All right. So solidify the deal. St. Peter's Basilica has not been completed yet and is going to cost a little bit of money. And the Pope could very well pay out of the riches that the Vatican already has. But he's like, nah, let's fleece the poor a little bit more. And Archbishop Albrecht is also trying to pay back the banking family and trying to get his loans paid off and to validate, his, I am the pluralistic bishop and archbishop of 3 different places. And so he agrees with Leo that they could come up with a money-making scheme that will take care of all of their needs. All right? So they're kind of in collusion together. Luther doesn't know this. Okay, it just kind of gets dropped on him because it happens to be in Albrecht's jurisdiction where these, and I told you it's like the McRib. They didn't have them every day. All right. This one time only, they're going to be able to sell some indulgences, and people are lining up so that they might have the ability to get access to them. All right. And that's sort of where the 95 Thesis falls. Okay. Why were the German princes so excited about being Lutheran?
Because they didn't want to deal with the tax.
Because there was a whole bunch of revenue that was leaving their jurisdiction and going to the church. So,
Yo,
okay.
I borrow your credit card for the FSU application.
Yes, sir. Let me